Good. I'm going to say morning. I think it is technically still morning. Good day. Thank you for joining me today to talk about a flight of innovation enhancing on-prem and multi-cloud SQL instance with a cloud cockpit. Thank you, ChatGPT, for coming up with that title. This is actually what happened because I thought Introduction to SQL Server enabled by Azure Arc sounds so boring, even though it would have been more on point. One thing in advance, this is your session. So all the ways to share your thoughts and communicate and learn are welcome. I got inspired with that slide by the amazing Lisa Hoving. All of us, we learn different. All of us, we consume content in different ways. So if you feel more comfortable standing, or if you feel like you got to leave the room, or if you feel more comfortable being on your computer, on your phone, taking notes on whatever, do whatever works best for you. If you have any questions in between, feel free to just interrupt. You please remind me that I actually repeat the questions if I forget, because I tend to forget. Thank you. Not right now, Jens, but because there was no question yet, but good job. My name is Ben. I go by the pronouns he and him. Got my contact details up there. We're not going to talk about all of that. We're going to talk about two things on that slide real quick. I'm running a podcast with the amazing Jess Pomfret called Finding Data Friends, and all of you are invited. We are on YouTube. If you just go to findingdatafriends.com or search us on YouTube. We do one episode every week with a couple of exceptions. We always release at 8:30 GMT on Fridays, except today, because everybody is here, so nobody would even notice if we publish an episode today. All of you are invited, and we would like to get to know the entire SQL community, the entire SQL family. So if you feel like being a guest on our show, just find me afterwards. I'll put your name on the list, and we'll have you in one of the episodes. And the other thing that I'm very passionate about is getting new speakers involved in the community. So if any of y'all feel like maybe it would be interesting to stand on that very stage or one of these similar stages at some point, we got some people like Peter, for example, in the room who just recently started speaking, who will be presenting here right after lunch on extended events. If you feel like speaking might be your thing, please also come see me, or actually any of the other speakers. With that, we only have 20 minutes, so I probably should get getting to the point. My resources are everywhere, and probably so are yours. Who of you has all the resources in one single place right now? Everything on-prem or everything in one single cloud? This is my shocked face. And that is the dilemma we're all in more and more these days, because you may have a cloud migration strategy, but you're not getting there for all of your legacy applications, et cetera, et cetera. And that is what Azure Arc is about. It's not an abbreviation, so do not try to come up with Azure Resource something something. It doesn't stand for anything, so I'm going to save you the trouble of figuring that out. What Arc is trying to do is, Arc is trying to connect Azure with everything else. Azure with other clouds, Azure with on-prem. But not from a migration scenario. It might lead into a migration scenario, but that is not the main purpose. The main purpose is bringing everything together under one roof, like an overarching thing. There we go. And there's all kinds of offerings around Azure Arc. That list is far from complete. I think at this point there's probably like 30 different Arc offerings, but those are the ones that matter to us as data people. Arc-enabled servers. SQL Server enabled by Azure Arc, which is what we're going to be talking about mainly today, but it's the same thing for Kubernetes, data services, machine learning. And you could split those into two groups. One of them gives you a central control plane. So all of your Windows servers, no matter where they are, showing up in the Azure portal. So you could apply the same Windows update policies, et cetera, to all of those. Run telemetry on all of those at the same time, et cetera, et cetera. That is the one thing. And it allows you to deploy Azure services everywhere. So through Arc, you could deploy a SQL Server managed instance, SQL managed instance, not server, on premises. Pretty cool stuff. But we're not going to talk about that today, because we only got 20 minutes, 16 at this point. We're going to start with Arc-enabled server. And you may wonder why, because we're all SQL, we're data people. The reason for that is that you need an Arc-enabled server to have a SQL Server enabled by Azure Arc. Formerly known as Arc-enabled SQL Server, formerly known as something something. So they changed the product name like 3 times over the past 12 months. What an Arc-enabled server does is, basically all you do is you apply a little script. That little script will install a little agent. That agent will start talking to the Azure portal. It will send your metadata, as in It will send what kind of operating system are you running, what's your patch level, etc., etc. So you get all that nice looking glass, and it will also start sending telemetry. And then you can enable additional services on top of that, Defender, etc. So you're kind of getting cloud offerings for your on-prem server. Why is that so cool? Because once you've got your server Arc enabled, you can Arc enable all the SQL instances on that box, or boxes. And that gives you all kinds of things. Monitoring, additional security stuff, best practice assessment. That list isn't even complete anymore, but I didn't fit any more icons in there. And we're going to see that most of that, what we're going to do, is going to be very demo heavy. It gives you pay-as-you-go pricing, AG management, additional dashboards, all these kinds of things. You just get additional value for your on-prem or non-Azure SQL server. So it would also work for a SQL server that you've deployed in AWS, for example. And it gives you all that at basically no cost. It does require you to have a license. It's always good advice to have a license for the stuff that you're running production workloads on. And it requires software assurance. That is the other requirement, that it is actually free, so it's not free. Plus, if you're uploading telemetry to Azure, you're going to pay for that storage, but that is really minimal / non-existent cost. With that, let's take a look at it. So, I'm in my Azure portal. And here in my resource group, how are we doing zoom-wise in the back? Is that good? Let me just group those by resource type, just so you see what I'm seeing here. We don't care about these, and not even those. That's where things get interesting. So here in my resource group, I have 3 SQLs that are showing up, SQL 01, SQL 02, SQL 03, that are all running on an on-prem box of mine. That is another important thing. You can only Arc enable anything that is not in Azure. It kind of gives you the same thing, because if you're running SQL Server on a virtual Azure machine, for example, it also gives you these additional insights, etc. But that's a different product. The idea of Arc is really getting something into Azure that is not in Azure yet. So if you're trying to run those enablement scripts on boxes that already are in Azure, you're going to get some very goofy error messages. So I got my 3 machines, I got my 3 SQL servers, and I got all of my databases here showing up. Let me show you first how I got there. In Azure, I go to Create, taking me to the Marketplace. I search for Arc SQL. It will tell me no results were found. I hit Enter. It will find some results. Who comes up with that? Not as confusing as North Europe versus West Europe, where North Europe is actually southwest of West Europe, but anyways. And then all you do is you hit Create, just like for basically any other Azure resource. It's going to ask you for a couple of things. You need a virtual or physical server running SQL Server. Probably makes sense if you're trying to Arc enable a SQL Server. You need a user account that actually has permissions to install a local service. You need PowerShell, not exactly correct. You need PowerShell if you're doing that on Windows, and you would need Bash if you're doing that on Linux. And you need a couple of resource providers registered, but basically that thing will do all that for you. Next thing you do is you say, okay, what's my subscription I want to use? What's my resource group I want to use? What's my region? What's my operating system? What's my server name? You can leave that blank, and then it will just take the box's name, which is especially helpful if you're trying to use the same script on a bunch of boxes, because you may not have one single on-prem SQL server, but 10, 15, whatever. Now you may be wondering, hang on, he said we're not migrating anything. Why do we need a region? That is the region where your metadata will end up in. Your database names might have customer names in it. That database name will be transferred into Azure. You may have GDPR issues, so that region might have to be something that is close enough to you. So while no actual data is ending up in that resource group, your metadata will, up to including some logs. So that is something to keep in mind here. Other than that, do you have a proxy? What is your license type? You can also exclude some instances, like when you're saying, I only want to Arc enable my prod instances, but I'm running all of my instances on the same box. Super best practice, have everything on the same box. What could possibly go wrong? but you only want to include those that are actually production instances, you could do that from here. Since we are technically creating Azure resources, you can provide some tags, and then you create the script, which in this case is a PowerShell script. If I had chosen Linux, it would have been a bash script. You download it or you copy and paste it, and then you just run it on that box. By default, it will ask you for username and password, which is fine if you're doing it for 1, 2, or 3 boxes. If you're like, yeah, but we're running like 1,000 SQL instances, we're not going to do that. You can also provide a service principal and then basically run it unattended. What that will do is it will first Arc enable your server, and it will then Arc enable your SQL service running on that box. That is all it takes. And again, up to that part, as long as you pick the proper license, which is either one of the free licenses like Dev Edition or Express Edition, or a paid license with SA, or the pay-as-you-go model, you're good. Since we already did that, let's go back here. What that gives me is, first of all, a lot of telemetry. So if I just pick the machine itself, nothing to do with the SQL server, this kind of looks like a VM running in Azure, and I can go like to my monitoring insights, analyze data, and I will see in near real time my CPU consumption on that box. I will see near real time my memory consumption on that box, my disk consumption, etc., etc. All of this is Azure Log Analytics. So I could start setting up alerts based on that. Hey, Azure, please let me know when my disks overflow. Hey, Azure, please let me know if I'm having a CPU contention issue for more than X minutes, seconds, whatever, on a certain box, etc. You could manage those alerts using the tags that I haven't provided, etc., etc. You could see your independent disks if you have more than one disk, unlike me, etc. But we're on the Windows level here. Let's go to the actual really cool part, the SQL instance. If we go here, all of these icons you saw on that last slide, that's what you find here again. And we'll just work our way down. So, SQL Server 2022 Enterprise Edition Windows. It is part of an always-on availability group. When was my last inventory upload? When was my last usage upload? That usage upload only really matters if you're using pay-as-you-go. But keep that in mind. Pay-as-you-go model means you could have that, you have that big Enterprise Edition box that is running that huge batch job every first of the month. And for the rest of the month, it's just doing nothing. You can either buy those perpetual licenses that you will pay for basically for the entire time, or just like fire that box up on the first of the month, or scale it up at the first of the month, if it's a VM, for example, just as you would in Azure. Pay as you go for those resources consumed, then scale it down again and either pay nothing if you actually stop it, or pay less if you actually downscale it. So that's a good starting point. Microsoft Entra ID, the artist formerly known as Azure Active Directory, and Purview. It actually takes 3 clicks to enable Entra ID authentication on a box like this. The only other thing that you need in addition to that is a key vault, because it will store some certificates and all that. Doing that, I can go right over here. Thank you for not working as you should, zoom it. Still, I'm logged in using my MyCorp SQL account into the other 2 boxes in the lower 2. I'm actually signed in using an Azure Active Directory / Entra ID account into the first box, because it is Entra ID enabled. So you can use any single Entra ID account to connect against that. So if you say, I got some resources in Azure, I got some resources on-prem, I got some resources in GCP, they may not even be using the same domains, and even getting people into your local Windows domain is kind of a nightmare when they're coming from the outside. Now you're using that one single global domain for all of your boxes. Question, Simon? What is happening? He just flipped his badge and it became an entirely new identity. So the question is how to do it for an on-premise SQL server, and I have to agree that I don't fully get the question, because this is basically made for on-prem or non-Azure SQL servers. For the purpose of that session, we will just assume a SQL server running in a VM on AWS is the same thing as a SQL server running on-prem. So if any SQL Server that is not running in Azure, for all of those, all that you do is you generate that script once, apply it on that box, and be done. In addition to that, once we're Entra ID authenticated, we could enable purview rules on that. And I'm not going to go into the details of all that, first of all, because I'm not smart enough to fully grasp the concepts of purview, but also because we don't have the time to do that today. Purview allows you to give very specific access roles to specific people under certain rules. Like, for example, these are my access rules for some maintenance team at a very specific point in time. And you can just manage all of that through purview and give them access to your resources and take them away again. Yes? So the question is, they're licensing their SQL Server on a VM host, on a host level, and therefore can use unlimited licenses. The answer is yes, they can use Arc at no additional cost as long as they have software assurance for that host. So software assurance is always key for the licensing part. Next thing I'm going to show you here real quick, best practice assessment, which I can run either on demand or scheduled, like for example, weekly. If you've ever used the best practice assessment for SQL VMs or SQL DBs in Azure, it comes up with all these super fancy hints where it's going to tell you, you got that index that never got really used, that database never had a backup taken from, etc., etc. That server has power save mode enabled, which you would not get for an Azure SQL DB, but here, so it's not just the same best practice assessments as for the SQL DB, but they're actually customized for that experience. And then you can filter them, like for example, hey, you're still using the SA account, that's not really cool. It has a very weak password. All these things that seem obvious, but that also helps people that may not have that big of a DBA team to point out these, because many of these things, let's face it, they are quite obvious, but not all of us have all these tools and scripts that will just pop them up. Super helpful for that. So going back here, we're not going to go into all of these detailed messages here. Patching. I could go ahead and configure patching for that box, so it will automatically apply critical and important updates on both the host and the SQL level in a specific time frame. Yes, I could use Windows Service Update services. There's other ways you can do that, but you may not have those in place specifically for your SQL part. Or you say, well, I do not want my regular Windows admins to be in charge of how SQL Server updates are applied, but I still want to manage it on a central level. Running one SQL Server, cool. Running 100 SQL servers, you may not want to do that manually, and you may still not have all the tooling in place to automate that. Properties just gives you a couple of more ideas. I'm going to go through those a little faster. Extended security updates, if you're on SQL Server 2012, or starting, I'm going to say mid-July this year, 2014, they are out of support. You could still get extended security updates. This SQL Server is not eligible because it's actually SQL Server 2022. Otherwise, it would show up here. You could get extended security updates for your on-prem box through Arc. I could go ahead and enable Defender, which gives me all these, including the real-time protection thingy against people trying to log. It basically comes up with everything that's like looking goofy and fishy to the instance. I could talk about Defender for 2 days, basically. But people are telling me I have to rush. So with that, I will actually go right here. And then we will see if we still have time for availability groups. What will happen on availability groups, I'm just going to do that verbally real quick. On availability groups, you could go to the Azure portal and do a failover from your availability group. From there, you could see the same dashboard as an SSMS. So it gives you, again, exactly that insight. But the fact alone that you could go to the Azure portal to do a failover on-prem, I think that's pretty cool. And the super cool thing we got here, if you have any database that is in full recovery mode, I could go ahead here and make it do a restore. And all I need for that restore is I want the name for the target database and a point in time. I don't have to care when my full backup was, when my last differential backup was, when my last transaction log backup was, because Arc is taking care of all of that. So basically all I'm saying is I want to keep those backups for anything between 1 and 35 days. And then I can go ahead here and be like, okay, IoT, restore. And I want that from 2 days ago. At that time, create, review and create. This will now go ahead back to my on-prem box and actually restore that database to that point in time. So Okay, we know something went wrong yesterday at 12 o'clock. We're going to restore at 11:59 from yesterday. We're at time, but there's one last thing, or two last things I'm going to show you. We got additional performance dashboards here. So additionally to that, what we've seen earlier with regards to the host level, we're going to see SQL-specific stuff here, including logs, including any contention, et cetera, et cetera. So also, what is the usage of my data files? That other thing showed me, hey, your disk is 80% full. That thing will show me, hey, your log file is only 10% used. And the very last thing, assessments. On a weekly level right now, that will run an assessment for your entire environment. Let me zoom out one tiny bit so we get them next to each other. And will then tell you, okay, given that environment, you could migrate to SQLMI, you could migrate to SQL Server and Azure VM, you could migrate to Azure SQL DB, or it will tell you this will not work for that case because of this and this. You could do this, but with that and that limitation, because you're using traditional on-premise domain accounts for security, for example, and it's not allowing you to do all that. So in those very quick 20 minutes, that should really be 23-minute sessions. That would have made my life so much easier. My intention was to show you how much you can get out of simply running, honestly, what is one single PowerShell script on your boxes. And all you have to do that is you go to the Azure portal, search for Arc SQL. It will tell you nothing has been found. Hit enter. That's the secret key. That's the magic sauce. It shows up. Generate that script. Just try it on a test box, and you're getting all of that basically for free. Please, we'll provide some feedback for this session. I'm also still here for questions. We're going to have a session right after this, so I will start packing, and we can continue the conversation outside. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you for your time. I know this was very rushed. I know this was a lot of content. Sorry, not sorry. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.